Get wrecked.
What's up, everybody? It's your favorite Ned Flanders here, back with another episode of Wrecked Wednesdays, the show where Big Papa Hunter destroys younger Hunter with facts, logic and common sense. Today, the video we're going to be looking at is this one, the truth about gender. Ooh. I made this video a couple years ago now, and I made this video for PragerU. So let it be known that at the time, PragerU paid me to make this video spreading blatant misinformation. Now, of course, I've since denounced a lot of my backwards and dumb views that I used to hold when it came to gender, but everyone's favorite Joel Patrick did call me out about this. He kind of accused me of being a little bit of a grifter for making money off of beliefs that I no longer held. To be fair, when I made this video, I believed what I was saying, but I still felt like, you know what, fine, fair enough. So I estimated how much money PragerU paid me for this video, and I donated it to an LGBT organization in Joel Patrick's name. I'm a humble guy. I don't need to brag. Some of you probably recognize this story. I have told it before. I think it's very funny. But all right, let's hear what Paige Shill Hunter Avalone has to say about gender.
PragerU has talked about gender before, and now I want to put in my 2 cents.
Oh,
How
boy.
often have you heard that there are more than 2 genders, and that gender is a social construct?
I mean, I've heard about there being more than 2 genders because I know cultures and societies have existed that had more than 2 genders before. And as far as gender being a social construct, that's kind of just a fact.
This has become a common liberal talking point. However, the notion that there are tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of different genders is not founded in fact. Oftentimes,
Really?
we're told that gender is a social construct, therefore it's entirely plausible that there are countless genders.
Just if something is socially constructed, it doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. It just means that it was constructed by humans for the most part. I've mentioned this in previous videos as well, but a great way to figure out if something is a social construct or not is just ask yourself, would this thing or this idea or this concept exist if humans didn't exist first? Money, for example, is a social construct. Just if something's a social construct, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
Now, the way you express your gender expression, is socially constructed, and there are countless ways to express your gender.
Gender expression is how individuals choose to express their gender. When we're talking about gender broadly, we're talking about the largely socially constructed norms and behaviors that are associated and oftentimes prescribed to women and to men and to boys and to girls.
However, gender in and of itself is more than a social construct and is reliant on biological traits. Research has shown that contrary to the popular progressive notion, gender is somewhat socially constructed, but it is not only a social construct.
This is a perfect example of a Mott and Bailey fallacy. The Mott and Bailey fallacy is a form of argument and an informal fallacy where an arguer conflates 2 positions which share similarities, one modest and easy to defend, the Mott, and one much more controversial, the Bailey. The arguer advances the controversial position, but when challenged, they insist they are only advancing the more modest position. So the modest position is that scientific research shows that gender is not just a social construct. Of course, some gendered expectations and gendered behavior is correlated with biological factors. For men, gendered behavior is oftentimes being strong. This gendered idea that men are stronger is ultimately rooted in the fact that males usually have testosterone, and the majority of males grow into being men. So it's not unreasonable at all to say that some gendered behavior, like men being stronger, is rooted in some biological characteristics here and there. But that's not a defining factor by any means. For example, if there was a man who wasn't strong, he doesn't cease being a man. And then the Bailey, the more controversial position, is that gender is somehow reliant on sex. What I'm making here is a causational argument. I'm saying that sex is what causes and dictates gender, but that is simply not the case. There's so much diversity in what boys and girls enjoy doing and the colors they like. Not only is this ridiculous, but it's also virtually impossible to prove causation.
The left claims it's more reasonable to believe in two sexes while also believing in multiple different genders.
Wrong. They're not just two sexes. This is such a childish view of these very complex issues. Sex is bimodal, so we have male, we have female, and it's kind of a sliding scale. There's a lot of nuance and in between there. Scientific American explains pretty clearly how humans are socially conditioned to view sex and gender as binary attributes. From the moment we are born or even before, we're definitively labeled boy or girl, yet science points to a much more ambiguous reality. Determination of biological sex is staggeringly complex, involving not only anatomy, but an intricate choreography of genetic and chemical factors that unfolds over time. So again, this idea that it's just XX, XY, men, women, two sexes, even that is like childish and not rooted in science. Look at this very complicated looking graph, which shows how complex human sexuality is. There's so many contributing factors into what makes humans the way that they are. This is just a highly reductionist viewpoint, and so no, the left doesn't really believe that there's only two sexes, and no one should just believe that there's only two sexes. For example, we know that intersex people exist, people who might be biologically female, but they have male chromosomes. Those people exist also. This idea that sex is just strictly binary is unrealistic and not rooted in fact.
However, sex is connected to gender. They are not separate entities.
That's also a lie. Gender is a social construct, and a social construct can sometimes be built around some levels of biological correlation, of course, but this idea that they're not separate entities, that is a lie. Virtually every single academic institution recognizes that sex and gender are different. You have to recognize the difference in order to even form opinions, to make policy, in how you educate people. There is so much that's reliant on this simple concept, this simple truth, that sex and gender are different things. The fact that I'm up here lying and denying reality to suit my own agenda is pretty despicable.
Multiple studies have revealed that gendered color preferences aren't simply a result of gendered social pressures. A 2017 meta-analysis found that both biology and society affect boys' and girls' toy choices.
All this article is really getting at is that gender is not 100% entirely a social construct, which again is like the most obvious thing. They talk about how the nature versus nurture idea is a false dichotomy when it comes to gender and sex. I also like how I didn't include this part. Evidence that gender has some basis in biology, though, in no way implies a strict gender binary, nor negates the existence of transgender and non-binary identities. Many biology-based gender differences originate from the hormonal environment within the womb, which is very different on average for boys compared to girls, but there's a huge variation in these environments. Within boys, there will be a range, and within girls, there will be a range. To say it's biological doesn't mean it's perfectly binary. So I'm bringing up this study right here to try and argue that there's only two sexes and there's only two genders and it's all connected, and the article that I'm using to argue that point doesn't even support the conclusion that I'm trying to arrive at.
An earlier study also found that women from non-westernized countries had an even higher liking for pinkish hues than their British female counterparts, despite being raised in a culture that did not conflate pink with femininity. Transgender individuals.
This doesn't prove anything. Like, if there's a woman who loves the color blue, that doesn't mean she's not a woman. Yeah, there might be an evolutionary basis from back in the hunter-gatherer days when women were gathering, they are drawn to brighter colors or whatever. There's arguments to be made there, but we're not slaves to biology. And all this really proves is that some gendered expectations, gender roles, and even gendered behavior might be socially constructed partially around some biological correlative factors. These kind of findings are also really disputed. For example, if you look back at like newspapers in the early 1900s, oftentimes pink was used as a gender-neutral color, but other people have argued that if you go even further back in the literature, there was actually reference to blue being for boys and pink being for girls. One thing I do know is that it's actually kind of a scientific urban legend that pink used to be for boys and blue used to be for girls. That's not really true. So even this concept here is just heavily disputed. There might be some level of biology at play here, but that doesn't really mean anything.
Transgender individuals actually prove that there are only two genders as well. First of all, transgender people can only transition from male to female or female to male.
That's sex. Again, conflating sex and gender. I sound so stupid here. Can I not? I really hate that I'm trying to play 4D chess with trans people to like justify my backwards, unscientific view of gender.
Male to male. There is no in between.
Male and female is sex. Transgender individuals sometimes keep their biology and change their gender. Other times, although it's kind of an outdated term, transsexuals will go forward and get the surgery as well. Another thing, non-binary people exist and can suffer from gender dysphoria as well. What's funny also is I'm so set on this like trans people are at odds with biology like argument here, but yet we already recognize other forms of identification that are malleable and that can change within our society. Let's say someone's a big New York Jets fan. They love football and they love the New York Jets. But then maybe one day they decide that now they're going to be a Green Bay Packers fan. How do they go from being a Jets fan to being a Packers fan? At the end of the day, ultimately, it's a form of identification. You might have never gone to a Green Bay Packers game in your life, but you could still be a fan of the Green Bay Packers. That is a form of identification that can change and that is malleable, and we have to recognize that gender is similar as well. Again, there is correlation to sexual characteristics, no one's doubting that, but we are not slaves to our biology. People are able to change and identify differently from their biology as well.
Called gender dysphoria. This is a very scary and serious condition where your identity no longer accurately reflects your sex. Part of the diagnosis for gender dysphoria includes a strong
Kinda seems like it proves that sex and gender are different, huh? It's almost like I got a little lost over here and I'm trying to use this now to justify there only being two genders, but I forgot my previous point, which was that sex is connected to gender. How does gender dysphoria exist then if people are suffering from distress and anxiety from that disconnect between what they identify as and what their biology is? How does that even exist then if sex and gender are just the same?
A strong desire to be the other gender. Even medical professionals who are trained to accommodate transgender people are reliant on the notion that gender is a binary, and we use the notion that there are only two.
So because an article said something about other gender and that implied that there were actually two genders, that proves my point. What the fuck am I talking about? This is so dishonest. There's so many mental gymnastics you have to jump through in order to actually think this is a legitimate point. No, people that are trained professionals recognize that sex is bimodal and that sex and gender are different. That's why gender dysphoria is a thing. What are you even talking about? Yeah, a lot of the times transgender people do identify as a different gender. Socially right now, we recognize two genders, but there doesn't have to be two genders. That's not a biological thing that must exist. These are just like incoherent arguments that don't prove the point that I'm trying to make.
A recent study found that brain activity and structure in transgender adolescents more closely resembles the activation patterns of their desired gender. If we can actually witness gendered brain structure, then gender must be on a biological level and more than a social construct.
What this study is actually proving is how ridiculous the notion that sex and gender are connected is. I mean, why on earth would we try and group people into these two finite categories of men or women, male and female, based on nothing but their anatomy, when now we know that their brains might function differently than their anatomy? It sounds like trying to connect sex to gender doesn't make very much sense. It's really weird how I keep bringing up these arguments here in the second half of this video that just destroys my earlier points. PragerU, you guys got ripped off.
The only evidence the left can provide to try and prove the notion that there are more than two genders is the example of intersex people, both sex characteristics. However, this is a birth defect that results in countless issues and does not benefit.
No, intersex is just that. Sex. We're talking about chromosomes and biology there. A good example of there not needing to be two genders is just looking at the multiple different societies that have existed that have recognized more than two genders, and also recognizing that the expectations, the behaviors that we assign to men and to women have also changed, evolved, and adapted over time and throughout history.
There has not been one recorded case of both genitalia fully functioning either. Using a birth defect to try and prove your point is flat out illogical from an—
I'm doing it! I'm doing the conservative stereotype here, where you just make the straw man and then you just attack that. No, intersex is oftentimes brought up to show that sex is not binary, to show that there are variables there and that people exist who don't fit in that binary. This isn't gender. This has nothing to do with gender. This is basically me just making an argument for something entirely different and then claiming I'm making an argument against there being more than two genders or something. Well, there you guys have it. Me making a bunch of really chaotic and bizarrely wrong claims. I have a headache, so I'm gonna go pop some pills. I'll see you all soon. Please give this video a like, comment below, sub to the channel, and I'll see you all soon. Peace.